Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you. It is so great to be here. I always feel like I'm not only among friends when I come to A.R.E., but I'm among collaborators. It gives me an opportunity to focus and question some of my own ideas. And I just can't begin to tell you what a great, great privilege it is for me to be here. I've said this before about A.R.E., but as Ronald Reagan said, if you believe in something, it's worth repeating, and I take that to heart. This, as far as I'm concerned, is the greatest growth center, greatest metaphysical center that our nation has produced. And I've been to lots of them, as many of you have. I've traveled around the nation, like most of you folks, and have spoken at growth centers and New Age centers in different cities and on the Pacific Coast. But there's really, truly something uniquely special about A.R.E. because it is the member-supported organization that Edgar Cayce and Hugh Lynn Cayce considered as vitally necessary if this nation was going to have an independent, non-affiliated metaphysical center. There was a time in Edgar's work in the early 1930s, after the hospital had closed due to problems not only economically across the nation, but due to arguments and frictions among various donors. There didn't really seem to be an association of the Cayce work beyond the sofa that Edgar would do his readings on and the kitchen table where Gladys and Gertrude would sit with him answering correspondence. And Edgar was heartbroken that his hospital had failed, that his relationships with donors in certain cases had turned fractious, and he felt like he had nothing. He was well into middle age, and he felt like his efforts had hit a terrible ditch with no sign of how to get out of that ditch. And Hugh Lynn had this extraordinary idea. And I ask you to listen to this very carefully because there was such genius and such power in what Hugh Lynn brought to his father at that dark moment. And he said, "Dad, we have been going about this work all wrong. We have created a situation where we are overly dependent, or we have become, in the past, overly dependent on one or two super wealthy guys, and if that relationship goes south, we have a problem. We have got to do this ourselves. We need our own vehicle where we have newsletters and magazines and conferences and a membership that doesn't just show up at the front door because they want a reading for one particular problem, or they want to contact Aunt Bessie just one more time and then they go away, but we have a membership that has a steady, concerted interest in ESP, in various metaphysical research, in spiritual self-development, and in the teachings that come through the readings, both medical, past life, and spiritual, and that they maintain this interest as a lifelong commitment. So when we come to A.R.E. today in the 21st century, and I can feel this as I walk the campus grounds, and I'm sure many of you feel it too, the buildings, the physicality of the place, this wonderful new stage that has been constructed, all of these things are just an expression of that one idea that Hugh Lynn brought to his father, and that was enacted by the love of the members. There are a lot of great spiritual centers in this country, and it's one way in which we're very fortunate. But I really don't feel that there's any spiritual center that has that kind of backstory. This place was born on the basis of an idea. An idea is an extraordinary thing. But I must also add this. For an idea to work, it also has to be executed with extraordinary dedication. And I'm going to return to that over the course of our discussion this evening, which of course is called Mind as Builder. A wonderful, I would say even foundational, part of the Edgar Cayce teachings. Edgar made reference in more than 600 readings to this idea that the mind is the builder. In a reading that he gave on July 15th, 1928, probably one of the great days in this spiritual work, Edgar, from a trance state, said, "The spiritual is the life. The mental is the builder. The physical is the result." Now, isn't that exactly what happened in connection with Hugh Lynn's idea? Hugh Lynn understood, let's take apart that statement of Edgar's by looking at Hugh Lynn's own genius. Hugh Lynn understood that this work that his father was doing was good work because it provided kind of a window, a channel of sacred influence into the world and into the life of the individual. So first of all, I think when dealing with the concept of mind as builder, one has to possess a certain kind of confidence, a real confidence. Now, a lot of people walk around and will acknowledge, I'm insecure, I'm not confident, and that state of expression is such that you'll have whole entertainers or comedians who build a character or persona, right, around the idea of being insecure. I'm thinking of Woody Allen, who's actually not insecure at all. He's an extraordinary artist and a very powerful person, but he built this whole stage persona around the idea of being this insecure, second-guessing kind of guy. And we all get it. We all recognize it. So people do have problems with confidence. So if the spiritual is the life, that contains, I think, the solution, to a lack of confidence. Is the work that you want to bring into the world, whatever it may be, is it spiritually sound? Is it something that is going to create a circuit of help and productivity to other people? And that requires some scrutiny, and it can take you in surprising places. Confidence comes from the willingness to be a vessel for something higher. That's where confidence comes from. That's why Hugh Lynn was confident. But don't get hung up on the details. Being a vessel for something higher can mean all kinds of things. I'm cracking up because every time I do an interview, wherever it is, whether it's on NPR or on a New Age radio station or with some mainstream newspaper, there's always the assumption, the journalist always assumes that we have to start off by somehow dumping on the secret. Everybody hates the secret, you know. No one ever liked the secret. And I have New Age people, and I call myself New Age. So mind you, when I use that term in a very positive way. You know, 20 million people bought copies of The Secret, but you can't meet anybody, you know, who actually admits to, yeah, I really like The Secret. No, I really think that Rhonda Byrne is great. You know, everybody has to participate in this backlash against The Secret. And people talk about, well, you know, the end of all spiritual work shouldn't be the manifestation of a Mercedes-Benz. You know, I've been in this work for a long time. I have never once seen anybody trying to manifest a Mercedes-Benz. I'm not sure that has ever happened in human history. But if it did happen, I would defend that person. I would defend that person. Because who am I to judge what creates value and productivity and goodness in another person's life? I can very, very easily imagine a scenario where maybe somebody grew up in circumstances where things were really ugly and depressing, and they want a way to get around in what is just simply a well-made car. It's no more or less than that. I'm not saying everybody go out and manifest Mercedes-Benzes, but I will never condemn that. So I don't want you to think that I'm getting all airy-fairy when I talk about the idea of a spiritual influence in your life having to be one thing or another thing. And I'm going to come back to that. But I think what you should do, what I should do, is try to grapple with the question of whether this thing that is wanted is really, really going to do good. And that it can become part of a circuit or a root work of good for another individual. And again, I have to emphasize, you don't have to let anybody dictate to you what that thing might be. I don't want anybody to be made to feel that they're shallow or that they're somehow not spiritual if the thing that they want might be some kind of material gain in the world, or might be something that's very much for yourself. A lot of good could come from that, a lot of good. But for Hugh Lynn, he was just bursting with confidence because he knew that his father's work was good work. And we know that. You will not meet anybody in the world today who says, oh, Edgar Cayce, yeah. He really screwed everything up for us, you know. Yes. We all know that this is good work, and it provides opportunities for kids, for seniors, for veterans, for teachers, for all kinds of different people. It's good work. So Hugh Lynn had a confidence that was born of understanding that the spiritual is the life. Everything has to emanate from the higher. And if you feel you've put yourself into the channel of that emanation, you should feel confident. You should feel very confident. And then Edgar said in this reading, this 1928 reading, the mental is the builder. The mental is the builder. Later on, he used the term, sometimes he would say, mind is the builder, mind as builder. Again, this concept appears in over 600 readings, so the wording would be different here and there. But at this inceptive reading, he said, the mental is the builder. What does that mean? What does that mean? It's a magnificent expression. And it was so suited to the times in which Edgar lived. Now, I feel strongly that nobody is just a vessel for a certain message. The message that comes through you, or the expression that comes through you, as with Edgar, is very much part of the times in which you live, the values that you have, the background that is yours. So Edgar, for example, when he was in a trance state, would speak in tones and with vocabulary that sounded very much like the King James Bible. And that was entirely natural and sensible given who he was. He was a Disciples of Christ Sunday school teacher. He was a man who read Scripture from cover to cover once every year in his adult life. He was a man who regarded himself first and foremost as a Christian, and at times he struggled to understand some of the teachings that were coming through him, such as reincarnation, astrology, numerology, things that are not commonly regarded as part of Christianity. Although I say commonly regarded, I think another aspect of Edgar's brilliance was that he could, I think with great personal integrity and understanding, interpret parts of the Gospels to make it clear that these prohibitions that are sometimes spoken of with respect to, say, reincarnation should not be taken for granted. Should not be taken for granted. I think Edgar showed tremendous integrity in looking at Scripture and saying, can I understand, without playing games, that these concepts can fit within a Christian framework? His answer was yes. So, this is why I say I think that the individual channeler is more than just a loudspeaker. A better way of putting it might be they are an instrument, a kind of Stradivarius, and you're going to get a very different sound out of a Stradivarius than you are out of a harmonica. And there are channelers today, and there are channelers that have come up all through our times since Edgar first used and popularized the term channel in his readings that sound very, very different. You know, Helen Schuckman of Course in Miracles did not sound like Edgar. Jane Roberts of the Seth material did not sound like Helen Schuckman. My friend Paul Selig, a channeler today, who some of you might know, doesn't sound anything like any of them. You know, there are channelers who have values and outlooks and ethics and reference points that come from their own times, and that's going to reflect how they sound, how they say things. I would hope and I believe that if what's being spoken is true, that there is a certain convergence, a fundamental respect for the human search, a fundamental belief that each individual is sacred and that doing violence of any kind to another individual, I'm not talking about defensive action, but violence to another individual, violates the most fundamental intention of what it means to be human. So there's a convergence, but every channeler is part of his or her own time. So it's very significant to me that in 1928, Edgar is using the term mental is the builder, or mind is the builder. Because the whole Western world at that time, although America in particular, was ignited with this idea that thoughts are causative. That was a very American idea, and it remains so to this day. And it underscores a lot of our national life in ways that people don't always pay attention to or realize, including people who say, I can't stand positive thinking. Get away from me with your refrigerator magnets and page-a-day calendars. You know, even people who take that position echo the basic tenet that thoughts are causative, the tenet that you hear put so beautifully in Edgar's teaching of mind as builder. This country, starting about 150 years ago, became a great springboard for that idea. There were various things contributing to it. It was not conceived of in isolation. Nothing is. But to give a very, very brief history, I love to make, enormous leaps of history. We'll go from Hermetic Egypt to the court of Louis XVI to, Phil Donahue. But I promise you, I never do it cheaply. I mean, we have a finite amount of time here, but I don't make cheap connections. In Europe, shortly before the time of the French Revolution, shortly after the American Revolution, there existed a figure in Paris by the name of Franz Anton Mesmer, who some of you have heard of course. Mesmer was a physician of a sort, didn't see himself as an occult figure, saw himself as a very rational figure, very much committed to the march of scientific progress. And Mesmer came to feel that all of life was animated by this invisible etheric fluid, which he called animal magnetism. That's where the term comes from. And Mesmer believed that if this etheric fluid was somehow out of balance, it could produce illnesses in the body or mental illnesses. And if somebody was suffering from some kind of physical malady or mental disorder, this animal magnetism was out of balance. And Mesmer believed that he could place people into trance states, and that from within these trance states, their animal magnetism could be readjusted in various ways. He called these sessions seances. That's where the modern term seances comes from. Seance in French roughly means sitting, although there's not any exact translation. It's so funny, we use these terms all the time. Seance, channeling, positive thinking, as if these things have always been with us, but they haven't always been with us. They're related to other ideas and people, but they started somewhere. Mesmer was an extraordinary catalyst and very controversial in his day. He had a lot of powerful friends, and he had a lot of powerful enemies. People who were into democratic revolution in France liked Mesmer because, and this is something that we lose this in our history, they liked Mesmer because they felt that if all of humanity was animated by this invisible etheric fluid, this animal magnetism, which Mesmer, if he were a religious man, might have called the soul, then we are all just branches of the same tree. And there's no upper class and lower class. There's no aristocracy. And some of Mesmer's students, who were very radical, were early voices opposing slavery. And they said, well, look, there can't be any difference between human beings, so what possible right does anybody have to enslave another person, rob that person of their physical freedom and human potential, if we're all animated by this invisible etheric fluid? Then we're all in this together. This is no joke. This happened. But if you go on Wikipedia today, you'll see, well, Mesmer was some nut in, Louis XVI's court who used to wave his hands in front of people's faces and put them in these trances. And it was all nonsense. These were really big ideas. And Louis XVI did not like Mesmer because he thought, this guy's getting up in my face here. I run things. I run things. I have the divine right of rule. Not my right of rule doesn't come from some animal magnetism. So Louis XVI decided to put together a commission of experts to study Mesmer, kind of like the doctors who used to stick pins and needles in Edgar's feet to see whether he was really in a trance state. Now, this committee was chaired by an American who was at the time this country's ambassador to France, a guy named Benjamin Franklin. And there were deep divisions among the founding fathers about Mesmer. Franklin was suspicious. Franklin didn't go in for any hocus pocus. Thomas Jefferson was suspicious. But you know who was a direct student of Mesmer's? The Marquis de Lafayette, the French hero of the American Revolutionary War, and a close friend of George Washington's. Did you know that George Washington and Mesmer exchanged letters? See, they don't teach this to kids in school, and they wonder why everybody's bored all the time. They take kids to a Shaker village and say, well, this is a bag of seeds, and here's a broom. Congratulations, But they don't tell them what was really going on. Now, this is a true story, as I hope is everything I'm telling you up here, but I really want to shout out that this is true, because it's not easy to find this stuff. And when you find it, you're apt to doubt it, but it's the real deal. I was sharing this story with Jenny and Cassie at lunch today. Okay, so Lafayette is a student of Mesmer's. And he thinks Mesmer is a genius. And he's writing letters to his friend, George Washington, in the newly established United States, telling him so. And Lafayette is planning in the fall of 1784 to make a visit to America because he wants to go up to a Shaker settlement in the city of Albany in upstate New York because he's heard about the Shakers going into these trance states, holding seances, receiving communications from beyond. And Lafayette thinks that what's going on with Mesmer and what's going on with the Shakers might be the same thing. So he wants to come check it out. So there's this story that starts circulating in American historical literature starting in 1940. There's an article in a journal called the German American Review that traces the history of Lafayette in this country. And it reports, this article does, that shortly before Lafayette was going to set sail for the United States, he had an audience with King Louis XVI. And King Louis teased him and said, "What is General Washington going to say when he finds out that his best friend, Lafayette, is a student of this sorcerer, Mesmer?" And I thought that line was so funny. It sounded like it was middle school kids teasing one another, And, and I said to myself, as I try to do as a historian, did Louis XVI actually say that? I mean, who knows? All the time people are attributing things. Napoleon supposedly said this. Gandhi or Napoleon said everything. And if they didn't say it, then Winston Churchill did. And it's just not realistic. Was somebody walking around behind Napoleon on the battlefield with a quill and leaf of paper writing things down while he was dodging cannon fire? I'm not entirely sure. So I asked myself, did Louis XVI really say this? And I began to search and search and search for the original source for the quote, and I was having a lot of trouble finding it. And eventually I was able to confirm it. He really did say it. Turns out that after the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror had passed, there was a French military officer who had spent a lot of years hanging around Louis XVI's court. I don't know how he survived the Reign of Terror, but he did. And he was, well, they would call him a courtier. You know, he's just one of these guys who hung around the royal court, gossiping and exchanging stories and not doing much of anything. Today he'd work for TMZ or something. But, and so only the French would do this. Only the French would do this. So he published this, shortly before he died, this 12-volume set of memories of the French court. In French, of course. It's available in the bookstore if you'd like it. And so I go into this thing. I don't speak French, but I have a friend who's a professor of French literature, and he helps me translate it. And sure enough, there it was. There's some guy sitting there in the royal court while Louis XVI is teasing Lafayette about being a student of the sorcerer Mesmer and saying, you know, what will your best friend, General Washington, think? Well, as it turns out, General Washington already knew and thought it was great because Lafayette had been writing letters to him, which are in the Library of Congress. So Lafayette comes to America in fall of 1784, that would be cool, to do his psychical research, which is exactly what he was doing. And he brings Washington a letter from Mesmer. And Mesmer writes to him, your friend Lafayette tells me what a great leader you are, and I think what you people are doing over there in America is terrific, and I would like you to permit me to open up a series of teaching academies in the United States. And Washington writes back to him, and this letter is in the Library of Congress. He says, well, thank you very much for your letter. My friend Lafayette has spoken very highly of you. Now, first of all, you don't need anyone's permission in the New Republic to open up teaching academies. If you feel like doing that, you may come on over and do it. And this was interesting. You know, Washington could still play the politician. And he said something like, if the stories that I have heard about you all turn out to be true, then you will certainly turn out to be one of the great geniuses of our age. You know, Washington just left himself that little way out. Magnificent man, but still a politician sometimes. So these are the kinds of things that were going on around Mesmer and mesmerism. You're not going to find that on Wikipedia, and you're not going to find that in classrooms when kids learn who the Marquis de Lafayette was. But that's a part of our history and a part of ourselves that we lose. These political revolutions, these movements for human dignity and freedom were very bound up with certain esoteric teachings and ideas. Because what was happening in Mesmer's seance parlor was not just fun and games with somebody waving his hands like a hypnotist in front of someone's face, but it gave people the first glimmer, the first sense in the modern world that there was some deeper aspect of who we were as humans that no label could be put on. Now, it very often happens that you'll have a great figure, a great thinker, and that person's students are what's necessary to take his or her teachings to the next level, to the level where they really start to gel and make sense to the day-to-day person. And such was the case with Mesmer. Mesmer, till the end of his life, remained very committed to this idea that human life was the product of this animal magnetism. He didn't want to hear talk about the soul. He didn't want to hear talk about it being something else or in the imagination or something. But some of his students began to feel that the master had uncovered something essentially true about human life, but was mistaken about this idea of an etheric animal magnetism. And they struggled to articulate the very earliest ideas of a subconscious mind. And they began to feel that there was this other mind, this higher mind, that was altogether different from the mind that we use day to day to solve math problems, to make grocery lists, to go through the commerce of ordinary life. They came to feel that there were two minds, that there was this surface mind that was rational and that got us through the events of the day, whatever they were, but that there was this deeper, much more formative mind that had influence over the physical. Now you got to remember, I mean, we're talking about people who were operating in the 1780s, the 1790s, the early 1800s. They didn't possess any kind of a psychological language. You wouldn't begin to hear Westerners talk about a subliminal or a subconscious or an unconscious mind until really the late 1880s, when William James and some of the people that he was working with on psychical research began to speak of a subliminal mind. And within that phrase, subliminal mind, was the seed from which Sigmund Freud and others derived the idea of a subconscious or unconscious, although Freud's idea was narrower than the idea that William James and some of his colleagues had. They saw the mind as some of Mesmer's students and offspring saw the mind, as something much larger and greater and more influential than the mind that we use to make up a daily shopping list. So, as is often the case with great ideas, mesmerism was never able to take flight in Europe after the French Revolution. Many of Mesmer's students were rounded up and imprisoned or killed. Many of Mesmer's critics met with the same fate. There was chaos. But a trickle of Mesmer's students began to come to the United States. And one of them became an instructor in French history at the military academy in West Point, New York. And in 1812, that man became one of the first people who gave public talks on mesmerism and demonstrations in America. And a trickle of other people came over from France. And this new generation, they really began to move away from this idea, this reliance on an invisible etheric fluid, this animal magnetism. And they grew much warmer to the idea that each of us contains a deeper, formative, causative mind that's really running the show, And so different people began to work with this idea, one of whom was a clockmaker who lived in Belfast, Maine in the early 1830s named Phineas Quimby, who some of you have heard of. And Quimby was suffering from tuberculosis, for which there was no viable treatment at the time. In fact, American medicine throughout much of the 19th century was a wreck, and it was actually much worse than things were in Europe, if you can believe that. In Europe, you had local physicians who had inherited some knowledge and understanding over the years. They had certain botanical remedies. They could set a bone. They had some rudimentary knowledge that would help them treat patients or at least alleviate suffering. You didn't have much of that in America because most of the people who were motivated to make the still very dangerous journey across the Atlantic, where you not only could be threatened by the elements, but you were threatened by these constant wars that England and France were involved in, where they were constantly sinking one another's ships, and it was very, very dangerous. People who were motivated to make that very dangerous journey were either fleeing religious persecution, one of the great engines behind our country's development, one of the reasons why mesmerism was dislocated to America, or people who had suffered such circumstances of economic depravity that they were lured on this very dangerous journey because there was a possibility of owning and maintaining their own land and having a chance to become something more than basically an indentured servant. Doctors back in Europe were fairly well treated. They were fairly well paid. They didn't have motivation to make this very dangerous journey. So for a long time in this country, and I mean a long time, like up until the 1890s, it was very, very hard to find any kind of talented physician in America. It was very hard to find people who could teach talented physicians. There was a long stretch of time in this country where we only had 3 teaching hospitals, one in Boston, one in Philly, and one in New York City. There weren't teaching facilities. You had physicians or so-called doctors, especially in the frontier states, who had actually never received any medical education at all, and anything that they were doing, like setting a broken bone, for example, they were learning from some books that they had read. And there were all kinds of remedies being used that were even medieval in nature. For example, people were applying leeches still, and there was this idea that like an open wound or a weeping wound was good because it was kind of getting out the bad humors, and it was not good, and people would of course die from infections. So American medicine was in a horrible state, and a guy like our clockmaker in Belfast, Maine, Phineas Quimby, who's suffering from tuberculosis, has nowhere to turn. So he tries this remedy one day that was suggested to him by a friend. In ancient Greek times, people would sometimes use horseback riding as a bodily tonic. And so Quimby goes on this kind of raucous horse and buggy ride through the countryside, and as he reports it afterwards, he felt sustained relief from the symptoms of tuberculosis. But he came to feel that it was not anything intrinsic to the horseback ride, but it was this feeling of emotional zeal that he felt from horseback riding. And he came to feel a certainty that the emotions played a significant part in the individual's health. And he encountered lecturers and other people who were touring New England and speaking about mesmerism, and he said to himself, these students of Mesmer are basically expressing the same insight that I'm trying to express, that there is this mental engine that's really running things, and we're not aware of it, we're not conscious of it, but it's ever operative. It's always going on. And Quimby, although he wasn't affiliated particularly with any church or congregation, he did have a spiritual outlook, and he married Mesmer's idea of animal magnetism and Mesmer's student's idea of an unseen or subliminal mind to a sense that there were these cosmic laws that created everything. Remember, the spiritual is the life, Edgar said. And that these laws affected our minds, and that our minds were engines of the human experience. Mind is the builder, Edgar said. And this was all transpiring 1830s, 1840s, and Quimby had a very influential student named Mary Glover, who later became known to history as Mary Baker Eddy. And she, after working with Quimby for a few years, had her own revelatory discovery. And she, in 1879, wrote a book called Science and Health, which became the basis for her new religion of Christian Science, the First Church of Christian Science. Now, Mary Baker Eddy had differences with Quimby, and these differences have been the source of too much debate, a debate that continues today. And I write about some of this in my book, One Simple Idea. Quimby's followers thought Mrs. Eddy stole her ideas from Quimby, and Mrs. Eddy, for her part, after being repeatedly attacked, started to strike back and said, well, you know, he was nothing but an ignorant carnival mesmerist. How could I possibly have gotten my ideas from him? And then at other moments she would cool down, I can assure you. And she was given plenty of grief. So I don't have a dog in that fight. I think that those differences are they're not such that anybody needs to be the bad guy. Nobody needs to be the bad guy. But for 100+ years, there have been these deep differences. They're unnecessary. Quimby was a genius. He had his system, he had his outlook. Mary Baker Eddy was a genius, I think one of the greatest spiritual geniuses that this nation has ever produced. And she had her outlook, and it was different from Quimby. She believed, in fact, that it wasn't sufficient or correct to talk about the human mind in the conventional sense, but rather that the mind as we know it was the seat of all kinds of corrupted ideas, violence, prejudice, hatred, illness. But that if you could, as Aldous Huxley put it generations later, if you could cleanse the doors of perception, the real mind, the mind of God, could come through. The other night, I watched the movie The Matrix with one of my kids. Many of you have seen The Matrix, right? Every spiritual group in America thinks, that's my ideas, right there, The Matrix. Everybody, you know. The Christian Science people and my friends in the Gurdjieff work, and everybody's certain that The Matrix came from them. I don't know where it came from. I know that it's a brilliant work of art. And I was struck by a scene in The Matrix where one of the characters, Neo, of course you know him, he was the hero of the movie, was sitting in his employer's office and was getting dressed down for something. And outside the window, there's a group of window washers using squeegees to clean the window. Well, that was Mrs. Eddy's philosophy. The idea was that we don't have useful minds. The mortal mind, the human mind, belongs to a lower nature of illusion, of illness, of prejudice, of violence. There's only one mind, and that's the mind of the Creator. And that when Jesus was healing people in the Gospels, in his medical ministry here on earth, we were seeing the operative use of the mind of God creating. But we don't experience that walking around in day-to-day life. We experience these illusory smaller minds that need to be dissolved so that the higher mind can enter. So Mrs. Eddy had her own theology and very radical metaphysic. All of these ideas that came from Quimby, that came from Mrs. Eddy, began to develop into different religious movements based around the idea that thoughts are causative. Mind is the builder. Now, American medicine started to get a lot better in the 1890s, particularly in 1892 with the founding of Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. Anybody here from Baltimore? Yay, okay. And great city in American history. Baltimore, once this research hospital had opened in Baltimore, America for the very first time, and this is 1892, I mean, this country is already pretty much past the threshold of becoming a superpower, but we get our first real serious teaching hospital in 1892 where there are residencies and there are regular lecturers and nobody's using leeches anymore and people are expected to serve several years of tutelage among an accomplished, peer-recognized physician. It was basically the system that was being used in Germany, which for the first time was imported here to America. So medicine begins to get a lot better at that time. And for some of the various people who were offshoots, and there were many offshoots of Mrs. Eddy's work, of Quimby's work, they not only start to feel a sense that their services are no longer as urgent as they might have been a generation ago, but they start to get shut down by licensure laws. There are many state legislatures across the nation who passed licensing laws that kept alternative practitioners from calling themselves physicians or healers or offering medical services. And William James, who is my true hero, he spoke out vociferously against these licensure laws because his position, and he was a Harvard-educated MD, his position was that we are going to strangle these new insights before we've had a chance to properly experiment with them. And William James felt that the state legislatures and some of the professional physicians guilds that were pushing for licensure legislation were not motivated by a concern for public safety. They were motivated by a kind of professional guild mentality in which the allopathic physician wanted to center himself in the medical world as the only practitioner who could freely advertise his services, freely practice medicine across state lines, be recognized as a sole legitimate medical practitioner. Now, I'm not going to say, and William James never said, that some of the alternative practitioners didn't have problems. They did have problems. There were people charging for services that they weren't capable of delivering. There were people making outrageous claims that they had no business making. But it wasn't compellingly clear that they were endangering the public health. And James felt that if you practice truth in advertising, and he did feel that laws could be passed and should be passed to enforce a kind of truth in advertising, at that point, let the individual make his or her own decision unless there's some egregious violation going on, and we can deal with that. But James felt that the evidence of egregious violations was very spotty, very anecdotal, usually drummed up by a kind of yellow journalism, and that it wasn't altogether clear that the public safety was at threat. This was a battle that James lost. The licensure laws really did come down like a kind of hammer. And the Christian Science folks were able to carve out some protections for themselves on constitutional grounds, but that's because they had a leader like Mary Baker Eddy, and nobody messed with Mrs. Eddy. I mean, she was brilliant. She was brilliant in every realm of life, and people, they just simply don't get her. You know, again, you can go to Wikipedia and you'll see things about Mrs. Eddy that paints her as being, you know, a cross between, you know, Osama bin Laden and the Marquis de Sade. You know, there's no understanding of what Mrs. Eddy was trying to accomplish. And I'm not some publicist for her church. They have problems. They have very serious problems, and they may be in very serious danger of disappearing demographically in a generation. But Mrs. Eddy was a genius. And I think she was not only a spiritual visionary, but she understood immediately as these licensure laws were coming down, well, you know, good luck William James, and William James admired her, but nobody is shutting down my church. And she figured out ways to carve out constitutional exceptions, which some people didn't. And so there were a whole range of practitioners that found themselves, if not shut down, then maybe feeling their services were less urgently required. But there were changes on the American landscape. Not only was medicine getting better, but commerce was booming. The stock market was founded and could seem sometimes to produce money almost out of the ether. Department stores were opening up around the country. Railroads were connecting towns. For the very, very first time in American history, you had a majority of people no longer earning their living from the soil, as Edgar Cayce did, but relocating and moving into cities. The Sears catalog was being shipped into households all over the country. All these alluring goods and mass-produced furniture and little trinkets that you could put up in your cabinet were suddenly coming within reach. And the fact is, Americans wanted a piece of the action. And some of the practitioners who were inspired by Mrs. Eddy and Quimby said, did you know this stuff can also get you rich too? And suddenly you had books like The Science of Getting Rich, like by Wallace Wattles, a book that I know some of you know. The Conquest of Poverty by Helen Wilmans, another true genius of her time. A wonderful magazine called Nautilus, edited by a woman named Elizabeth Town. And they were into the idea that this new mental metaphysics, sometimes called New Thought, sometimes called divine science, sometimes called science of mind, there were all kinds of different names being used. New Thought became the predominant name, but all kinds of names. Unity was also a very dominant name. This new mental metaphysics could not only heal the body, but it could heal the wallet. It could heal the pocketbook. It could help you meet a boyfriend or girlfriend. It could help you get married. It could help you with every conception of success. And Americans were ready to listen, and they flocked to New Thought and Unity and divine science churches. They bought a new popular literature that sounded a great deal like The Secret. Much of it served to inspire The Secret. And, you know, a friend of mine puts it this way. For an idea to succeed, it has to have a constituency. It is not wrong to want people to hear what you have to say or what you want to express, because the life's blood of that expression is a constituency. You know, Jesus didn't sit by himself somewhere staring at the ground. He spoke on a mountaintop. And so the American way was to speak to a broad audience. And the people came. And let me tell you, there are letters and articles and journals and diaries where people speak of having the most meaningful experiences of their lives reading a book like The Science of Getting Rich, or reading a book like Helen Wilmans' The Conquest of Poverty. Wilmans had this great story. She was a newspaper reporter in Chicago in the 1890s, one of the pioneering female newspaper reporters in America. And everything went wrong for her. She was fired from her job. She was divorced from her husband. She was going to get kicked out of her boarding house for not paying the rent. And she said she wanted more than anything to start her own New Thought newspaper. She wanted to start up a newspaper that would bring these ideas to the American working person. And she asked her employer if he would help invest in this newspaper. And he laughed at her and he said, you know, that's preposterous. And she said she was so furious, she was filled with rage, and she was kind of tears were welling up in her eyes, and she left the newspaper offices, and on a dark winter November afternoon, she went walking through the streets of Chicago, and she thought to herself, I have no one in the world on whom I can depend, absolutely no one. And then she said, just as those words formulated in her mind, she was filled with this euphoric sense of confidence that she didn't have to depend upon anyone else. That if she really believed what she was saying, that there was this higher mind, she could accomplish everything she wanted without the assistance of a man, of a financial backer, of anybody. And she flew back to her boarding house, filled with excitement. And her landlord, who was about to kick her out, said, what are you doing here? And why aren't you at work? And she explained her idea, and he was so thrilled by it that he financially backed her. I know this story is true because her newspapers got put out. It happened. And she, for a period of time, was one of the most influential religious figures in this country, even though her name is not remembered. Helen Wilmans. Read her book, The Conquest of Poverty. What happened to Helen Wilmans is she was greatly rich and successful and a good person. She moved to Florida to open up a metaphysical university. She would offer prayer treatments by mail. And there were some local real estate big shots in Florida who didn't want this woman coming in, buying up tracts of land, and challenging them as to who was going to be the big chief in town. So they used political connections. It was all corruption. And they asked the Postmaster General to investigate Helen Wilmans. And the Postmaster General did so and said, she's selling this humbuggery over the mail, this New Thought stuff. And they revoked her privileges to use the mail. And she fought them in the courts and fought them and fought them. And there was one federal judge, this is one of my favorite lines from judicial history. He said, the court is not a committee on psychical research. She's doing absolutely nothing that violates the law. People are entitled to make these claims. She's not defrauding anyone. These aren't ruinous sums of money that people are sending her. If George Washington said Mesmer could come over here and open his schools or do whatever he felt like, why couldn't Helen Wilmans charge people modest rates through the mails for prayer services? There's nothing wrong with it. But it didn't matter because the court battles drained away all of her income. She remarried. Her second husband passed away. She tried to start a new magazine. And do you know, even though she won the federal court cases, the Postmaster General still banned her from using the mail. It was political corruption. They choked off her air supply. She couldn't make a living. And soon thereafter, she died in 1907. It was political corruption. But she was a giant. And the people who read her stuff, her pamphlets, her books, who were in touch with her through the mails, they loved her. But once you're banned from using the mails, it's like being banned from using the internet and social media. Your air supply is gone. But what I'm trying to say by telling these stories to you is that no historian can stand up to me and say, oh, this was all just a bunch of American gullibility. This was all just snake oil salesmen. Everybody loves that phrase, snake oil salesman. Was there actually ever even snake oil? I'm not sure. It's like the manifesting the Mercedes-Benz thing. Did that ever actually happen anywhere? I don't know. But there's simply no historical validity in saying, if you want to deal with it on historical terms, and I'll discuss it on metaphysical terms, or I'll discuss it on historical terms. I care deeply about both. There's no historical validity to say that this was just a story of some megalomaniac shearing sheep. That wasn't the history of New Thought in this country. It simply wasn't. And during periods of economic depression, New Thought provided a tremendous lifeline to people, as I believe it continues to today. Books like Think and Grow Rich, How to Win Friends and Influence People, and lots of others that were less famous were all published in the midst of the Great Depression. And they weren't offering people false hope. They were offering people concrete ideas. How do you behave in the workplace? What is a way to get things done inside of large organizations? A lot of Americans who had been raised on a farm, maybe that very same generation, found themselves working for corporations, for large businesses in offices for the first time in American history. They didn't always know how to behave. So a book like How to Win Friends and Influence People would help teach them to behave. And I tell you with dead seriousness, I wish that everybody in the 21st century would read that book again, because we have a whole new advent of social media and people have no idea how to behave. You know, one moment you have a shade of a different opinion from someone and you're being called Hitler. That's how we do things on social media today. And I see that young people sometimes in office settings do not understand that an email is not a social media posting where you either ignore it or respond to it based on how you feel. Email is like talking to someone face to face. And if you ignore an email, it's literally like standing there just like that, and it engenders the same response, which is bewilderment and hostility. So we shouldn't be so fancy as to think that we no longer need books like How to Win Friends and Influence People. We desperately need such books. I personally believe that the rising generation, that my own kids, desperately need such books. But my kids are rebelling against me at the moment, so they don't want to read those books. I was telling John Van Auken, they say things to me like, "There's no evidence for Bigfoot. There's no evidence for ESP." I'm like, "Don't you say that in this house." And so I got these Bigfoot bandages the other day, Band-Aids, and I said to my 11-year-old son, "Who wouldn't love a Bigfoot Band-Aid?" And he said, "Scientists." This is how they degrade me. So I'll say something about like ESP research at Duke University, and my younger boy Toby, who's 8, will say, "Is there any evidence for that?" It's like, yeah, but children have to rebel. It's natural. It's natural. So they'll see. And they'll see. Their own children will be A.R.E. members. So this history, it's more than just history. It's a body of living ideas that has affected people in this country, people in other countries, for many, many generations. And I think I strongly feel, has for some people resulted in some of the most profoundly meaningful experiences of their lives. And that continues to be true. So, to return to what I was saying about every channeler being a product of his or her times, every channeler using language and ideas that comes from his or her experience or background or what have you. This was true of Edgar. When Edgar says, "Mind is the builder," in 1928, an idea he would return to literally hundreds of times, he's both stating a universal truth and providing this wonderful, powerful summary of the new metaphysics that is sweeping through the Western world at the time. Once you hear that phrase, "mind is builder," you never forget it. There's a certain solidity to it. And so we have Edgar observing from a trance state, the spiritual is the life. The mind, or the mental, is the builder. The physical is the result. The last portion of his statement. Is the physical the result? And what do we mean by physical? Mesmer and Quimby and others believed that, yes, in fact, the direct connection to physical wellness is through the agencies of this hidden engine of life, whether you call it animal magnetism or whether you call it the subconscious mind or the higher mind. Mrs. Eddy believed that everything resulted, physical health, everything resulted from the individual becoming a, she wouldn't have put it this way, but I'll put it this way, a cleansed door of perception. The individual coming into the higher realization that one great mind controls everything, and that that's where goodness comes from, that's where health comes from, and so forth. Edgar certainly believed that the energies of the mind were fundamental to health. However, I must point this out. Edgar's ideas were not identical to Mrs. Eddy's. Edgar also believed that we do live in a world of concrete physicality, that is part of the human experience. Mrs. Eddy would have denied that. She would have said, no, that is delusion. That is a figment of your imaginal mortal mind. We do not live in a world of concrete experience. Mrs. Eddy would have agreed with the makers of The Matrix, I think. She would have felt they were right. Edgar was wrong. But my sympathies are with Edgar's perspective, and I'm going to try to explain why. Now, when he says the physical is the result, first of all, that must be interpreted broadly. He's talking about health, but he's not talking about only health. He would also have applied that to the room that we're in, the buildings that make up this wonderful campus. Hugh Lin has an idea. It's right. It's channeling of the good. There's love in it. That idea translates to other people, including all of us right here in this room, and we provide the skills and the resources and the membership and so forth necessary for A.R.E. to exist. So that's a perfect model of what Edgar was talking about. He was talking about the physical in all senses. Now, but he also clarified in other readings that humanity does live under physical forces, and we do experience the physical. Now, this is an area ripe for experiment within New Thought philosophy, within Mind as Builder philosophy, and frankly, it's the most important question, most important idea for me personally right now, and I'm struggling with it. And I invite you guys to struggle with me. And I'll describe to you what this struggle is. There are brilliant, brilliant teachers, from Mary Baker Eddy to Neville Goddard, who is my personal go-to guy within the field of mind metaphysics, a man who I truly, truly love. He was a brilliant metaphysical teacher who died in 1972, and he's the most influential person in my life. I love him. Neville maintained that mind is so much the builder that we don't even begin to realize the depth and the extent of that statement. Neville maintained that the human imagination is the God of Scripture, and that everything you read in Scripture is a kind of parabolic reenactment or an allegory of this idea that the imagination is all creative, that the human mind married to the emotions is God, And he meant it in the most literal sense. And when I read Neville, it's like I'm getting drunk on spiritual wine. The Shakers used to use that expression. They were abstinent, but they would talk about receiving spiritual gifts that gave them pleasures that went beyond anything that could be physically conceived. Neville argued for this thesis with such exquisite persuasiveness. And no matter how many times he restated this idea that the human imagination is God, it always sounds like he's speaking it or writing it for the very first time. And if you haven't experienced Neville's essays or lectures, I urge you to. I urge you to. I just did an audio of Neville's first book called At Your Command, and coupled with that audio is my essay on his life called Neville Goddard, A Cosmic Philosopher, in which I talk about some of his ideas. He could state these things with such exquisite clarity that I challenge anyone in this room to read or to listen to one of Neville's books or lectures and not feel that you haven't just encountered possibly one of the most formative experiences of your life. And Neville could state this thesis that the imagination is God, that imagining creates reality, in such a simple way. The man never used a 50-cent word. It was simple and beautiful. And if you really believe in what you're talking about, and you really know what you're talking about, you ought to be able to speak very, very simply. Something that causes me to continually lose friends in academia, but something that I sincerely believe. Now, if I love Neville so much, and I do, and I'm so convinced by his conviction that imagining creates reality, that the human mind is everything, why do I also agree with Edgar that there are certain physical limitations that we must live through and must experience? What I think, the challenge that I'm describing, is that some of us in the New Thought movement, a movement of which I consider myself a part, some of us in the New Thought movement believe, as Neville does, as I suppose Rhonda Byrne does, that all of life is subjected to one great mental super law. Some people call it the law of attraction, but it's this ever-operative great mental super law. And that is the ultimate truth of life. Now, I think, and I'm really struggling with this, I think that that is very possibly true, that we do live under one ultimate mental law. But for the clock on the wall, we won't have time to get into all of that, but I think we get very serious hints of that in certain quantum mechanics experiments which have been going on for 80 years and are just so extraordinary, so extraordinary. Anybody who thinks those ideas can be put in a box just doesn't understand those ideas. They are magnificent. I think it's very possible that we really do live under this ultimate law of mind. But I also think that we, as existent beings, are not necessarily able to experience that truth in the dimension of reality that we occupy. For example, you could talk about the law of gravity as being an ultimate truth, and it is. For a law to be a law, it has to be consistent. It has to be ever operative. But the way that you experience gravity on the Earth is going to be very different from the way that you experience gravity on the moon, or in outer space, or on Jupiter. The same law is always going on. It's real, it's there. But I'm not necessarily going to be capable of experiencing it here on Earth the way that an astronaut might experience it on the moon. And that also begs the question of whether we live under multiple laws and forces. Yes, gravity is always going on. Nobody questions that. But mass is also always going on. So if you're on the planet Jupiter, which is a much more massive planet than Earth, you experience a much heavier pull of gravity. So if you were physically on Jupiter, the gravity would crush you. You wouldn't be able to move. It's the same law that goes on the moon, where you actually would be much lighter and could jump 5 feet in the air and, hit the golf ball way across the green and such, because the moon has less mass. So the point is, I don't have to argue whether gravity is there or it's not there. It certainly is there, but it operates differently on different levels of existence, of reality, of circumstance. Look, these bodies physically decay, and mortality is a fact. Regardless of whether you want to go or not, someday we're all going. And much as I love Joseph Murphy, for example, the great New Thought teacher, Murphy will sometimes seek to explain away mortality in terms of it being educative and life being unbearable if immortality existed and so on and so forth. And that's true enough. But physical decay is a fact of life. I have seen no exception to it. That doesn't mean that Neville is wrong. But I do think that even for a law that is as ultimate as mind, if we can suspend any disagreement about that, there are still other circumstances, matters of reality under which we live. We aren't God. We aren't God. My Father is greater than I, Jesus said. Neville quotes that all the time. I think if Neville were here, and I wish he were, and maybe in some way he is, he would probably agree that the branch and the tree are the same thing, but they do experience different circumstances. And wind can blow down a branch, and it can't blow down the tree. We're not God. So I think Edgar was trying to express that when he said, it's not sufficient to say that we live under this one and only exclusive influence. We do have physical lives. We do have physical lives. But the extraordinary thing is, we as individuals can experiment with this question as to how or whether or what degree the mind serves as the medium of influence over the physical. That is the great challenge of our generation. And we are living through extraordinary times in revelations about that challenge. Every word that I've described to you here tonight would come across as completely alien to most physicians and scientists who are working with placebo studies or in quantum physics or in a field like neuroplasticity, where thoughts are actually seen through brain scans to alter the neural pathways of the brain. That's what's happening in the field of neuroplasticity. The ability to sustain and hold a purposeful thought, whether it has to do with a habit that you want to break or an addiction that you're dealing with or other matters, problems stemming from obsessive compulsive disorder, if you can successfully and sustainably redirect your thoughts, brain scans can actually demonstrate, and have been demonstrating for 15 or 20 years, that the actual neural pathways, the gray matter in your brain, will be altered. This is a fact, as provable through brain scans as any aspect of physical existence. And it cuts against everything that we learned growing up, in the sense that it's mind over matter. It's literally mind over matter. The physical is the result. Well, look at neuroplasticity. Now, there are some brilliant scientists working in neuroplasticity, but if I said to them, hey, have you heard of Edgar Cayce? The answer you can only imagine. But not all of them, not all of them. There's a guy named Ted Kaptchuk who heads up a study, a center in placebo studies at Harvard Medical School. Now, I want to be very careful when I get into this territory because Harvard Medical School is a lot like Napoleon and Gandhi. Supposedly they did everything, they said everything. Everybody's always got a Harvard Medical School report that proves everything, you know. Fiber's good for you, fiber's bad for you, positive thoughts are good for you, positive thoughts are bad for you. So I try to be very careful when I'm making reference to Harvard or any place. This mic is banging against my rosary beads, which is why you guys are hearing that strange sound. Sorry. You came to an Edgar Cayce conference. No, I'm kidding. I apologize. I'll try to stop moving around. Ted Kaptchuk is a great scholar and scientist, and he runs the Center for Placebo Studies at Harvard Medical School. He's done lots of fascinating things along with his colleagues. Now, in December of 2010, Harvard Med published a study that some of you may have heard of. It's called the honest placebo study sometimes. They found that in taking a group of people suffering from irritable bowel syndrome and giving them a transparent placebo, in other words, they gave them a sugar pill and they said, you know what's in here? Nothing. And they transparently told them this. People still, a significant number of subjects still reported substantial and sustained relief from this so-called honest placebo. And the question is astonishing. Why should this be happening? You're being told that you're being given nothing, and you still feel better. Now, everyone has their own pet theories, I have mine, as to why the study produced those kinds of results. But the Harvard researchers, to their great credit, chose not to interpret their results. They said, what we're seeing is astonishing and it calls for more research. To which I say, amen. We need more positions like that in public life. We need questions. We don't need polemics. We don't need certainties. We need questions. And the Harvard team was willing to hold a question. I thought that was beautiful. Now, they published another study in January of 2013, and I encourage you to look these things up yourself because I don't want anybody to feel that I'm playing fast and loose with medical studies that somehow magically seem to support my point of view. That's not my intention. So Ted Kaptchuk's team at Harvard publishes another study in January of 2013 in which they demonstrate that migraine sufferers experience a significant degree of sustained relief if the researcher or the physician who is dispensing their migraine medicine speaks in favor of the prescription. If your doctor or caregiver tells you that these meds are really great, and you believe that, in other words, you're told in a convincing way that you have no reason to doubt, that encouragement will produce a greater net improvement in your sense of recovery and well-being. No, not just in your sense, but actually. We measure pain by asking patients, how do you feel? We don't have any magical ways of measuring pain. It's a very individual, intimate thing. So, migraine sufferers experienced significantly higher belief if their caregiver spoke convincingly of the prescription. Now, that very same insight was made by a French hypnotherapist, somebody who I've written a lot about and who I really love, named Emile Coué, in the very early 1900s. You have heard of Coué because he's the guy who came up with the mantra, day by day, in every way, I'm getting better and better. You know that mantra? Everybody thinks, what serious person would possibly believe that you could be helped by something like that? Well, the Harvard study validated one of Emile Coué's core insights, because one of the things that got him on the scent trail of these mind power metaphysics was that when he worked as a pharmacist in northwestern France, in a town called Troyes, in the early 1900s, he discovered all on his own that if he spoke in favor of a formula that he was giving to a patient, the patients seemed to really do better. So I'm reading this Harvard study, and I'm saying to myself, more than a century ago, Coué had this exact same insight. And I decided to try a little experiment of my own, and to see if any of the members of the Harvard team had heard of Coué, on whose shoulders they were standing. So I reach out to the guy who's in charge of the, not so much in charge of the study, but he's the one who's supposed to speak to the press. Reach out to him, he never gets back to me. And I say, well, we will not have this. And so I reach out to Ted Kapchik, and not only does Kapchik get in touch with me, but he says, of course I know Coué. I think he's great. And he quotes his day-by-day mantra, and he said, we were not thinking of Coué, no, when we devised this experiment, but it would seem to comport with his insights. And I thought, thank you, thank you. There is one brilliant scientist who's not afraid of consorting with disreputable New Agers like myself. And we are living in an age right now where all kinds of extraordinary insights are being discovered, or should I say not discovered, but validated by science, that our ancestors in the New Thought movement, and that Edgar Cayce and that Mary Baker Eddy and others were already aware of. In fact, neuroplasticity, which I mentioned just a moment ago, is one of the most extraordinary fields, where a wonderful scientist named Jeffrey Schwartz at UCLA, in working with people who suffer from obsessive-compulsive disorder, found that if he could enlist people into a program of consistently redirecting their thoughts, not only would they experience relief from some of the ritualistic behavior associated with OCD, but this was one of the scientists who discovered that brain scans could actually measure and demonstrate physical changes in the gray matter of the brain on the basis of this redirected mental force, as he called it. And he said, this is something contrary to everything that I learned coming up in my career as an MD and a research psychiatrist, which is that mind is affecting matter. And everything in the reasonable intellectual makeup of the medical researcher wants to deny this because it doesn't make sense apropos of what we learned in med school. But there it is. There are the brain scans. And he feels, quite brilliantly, I think, that there should be a dialogue between medical researchers who are working on neuroplasticity and physicists who are working in quantum physics. Because what he's saying is, we're seeing a marriage of influences here. If in the quantum physics lab, the presence or a position of a particle changes based upon the decisions of the observer to measure it, to not measure it, to measure it again. In other words, you have particles that exist in what's called a state of superposition. It's a wave state. They are in more than two places at once. That's a fact. We know that because we can detect interference patterns. So if you were to, so to speak, fire a subatomic particle at two boxes, it is provable that that particle was in both boxes at the same time. That can't be, right? Stuff is in one place. The flowers are here. They're not here and there. Well, they are here and there, apparently. If a law requires consistency, then what's happening with subatomic particles must be happening in outer life. But why don't we see it? You know, we know the flowers are here, not there. That's reality, right? Well, is it? Is it? Again, people think they're discovering this stuff for the first time, but William James wrote about this in 1902 in a series of lectures that became his great book, Varieties of Religious Experience. He said that the mystic might be like a kind of microscope. The closer and closer and closer you get to something with a microscope, the more information that you receive. And the further and further and further you pan back, the more information gets lost. We see this all the time. If you take an image and you copy it by some means, including digitally, over and over and over and over, that image will start to lose resolution. And that's true digitally as much as it is if you're using photography. It's a fact of life. So there were recently a couple of scientists in the Quantum Physics Journal who tried to deal with this very same question. If a particle, okay, can be demonstrated to be in a state of superposition, in effect, in two places at once, or really in an infinite number of places, until someone chooses to take a measurement, at which point in the quantum physics lab, the particle is localized to one place. It doesn't make any sense. They asked the same question. And without paying homage to my hero, William James, they came up with a theory that they call information leakage. And they said the same thing in the 21st century that James said back in 1902, that it is possible that if you're looking at something with very, very, very fine instrumentation, you are getting all kinds of data and learning all kinds of stuff that we lose when we pan backwards. You pan the microscope or the camera backwards, and the data becomes coarser, less reliable, less detailed. So these scientists thought maybe what we call the surreal in the quantum physics lab is actually what's really going on all the time. And maybe it's our decisions, as with the quantum researcher in the lab, that determines what will be there. So there's an idea to experiment with. It's unfortunate that we have, in the same way that William James described it back in the 1890s, we have this guild mentality where nobody wants to throw open the doors so that we can glean and garner insights from across as many fields as possible. Now, Ted Kapchuk at Harvard knows who Emile Coué is. So he demonstrates that you can be interested in metaphysical thought and you can conduct scientific research at the highest level, and one can inform the other. Now, since I have lost my grant-making ability at Harvard Medical School, the laboratory of experimentation that I have to work with, and that I would ask you all to work with, and many of you are working with it, is your own experience, your own lives. I love the popular literature of positive thinking. I think it's wonderful because everyone who I've just mentioned to you, every figure, every name, from Helen Willmans to Emile Coué to Neville Goddard to other more recent people, all of them expressed insights that are being validated today in some of these experiments. And you and I, who have needs in this world, who have goals and dreams in this world, should be using these methods to experiment with ourselves. And there are thousands of them. And the reason that I love the positive thinking literature is not only for its early insights, but for its complete and total practicality. I'm going to mention 3 exercises really quickly, and then I'm going to stop because I want us to have time for exchange before the clock on the wall runs out. Emile Coué had an insight that has also been validated by contemporary researchers, and it was this. Your mind seems to be exquisitely sensitive and powerful when you are in what is sometimes called today the hypnagogic state. Very simply, that's just the very relaxed, comfortable state you're in just before you drift off to sleep at night, or just before you come to full consciousness in the morning. Coué recommended that when you are in that exquisitely relaxed, sensitive state, you use his key mantra. You repeat it silently, or you can meld it just to a whisper, almost like you're praying. Day by day, in every way, I am getting better and better. He believed you should repeat that to yourself 20 times just before you're nodding off to sleep at night. 20 times again, just as you're coming to in the morning. He recommended getting yourself a little thread, nodding it 20 times, so you could use it to count off your mantras almost as if you're saying a rosary. That's an experiment you can try. If you don't want to use Coué's mantra, you can use a different mantra. There's all kinds of things that you could use. You could use that exquisitely sensitive period of time to present yourself with a problem that you want a solution to, or to present yourself with a decision that you're trying to make and you can't figure out what the right thing to do is. Now, we don't have time to get into this, it'll have to be another conference, but I take very seriously and I care very deeply about ESP research or cyclical research. It's another one of these things that, you know, you go on Wikipedia, you simply won't get anywhere. The facts aren't there. They just aren't there. But there was a great ESP researcher named Charles Honorton, who died at a very young age of 44 in 1992. And Honorton, in the 1980s, did a series of experiments called the Ganzfeld experiments. Ganzfeld is German for open field. He hypothesized that if you could induce this hypnagogic state in people during their normal waking hours, this exquisitely relaxed state, a state of very comfortable sensory deprivation and a comfortable physical state, it might serve to heighten the psychical powers of the mind, which he hypothesized were present. So he would conduct experiments, tens of thousands of them. People have no idea how hard the real parapsychologist works, how rigorous and lonely and painstaking his or her field is. They have no idea. He conducted tens of thousands of experiments where he would take 2 subjects. He would put one into what we would call like an isolation tank. They might go in a reclining chair, the lights would be dimmed, they'd be wearing headphones that emitted a kind of white noise or maybe blocked out all noise. They'd be wearing an eye covering, very relaxed, comfortably sensory deprived state. And he would have another person outside the isolation tank trying to mentally send pictures to that person. And he found, following tens of thousands of trials, I write about this in my book, One Simple Idea, that you were getting a higher hit rate of receivership, higher guesses, if you want to call it that, of what pictures were being mentally transmitted when you were in this state of exquisite mental relaxation. It was exactly the insight that Coué had, and what Honorton was finding was there was something that was going beyond the 5 senses when you were in that state. Something else was happening. Now, people don't know about these things because, now my book, there was one reviewer who loved it in Business Week. There was one reviewer who hated it in the Wall Street Journal, but they both said, Horowitz is going to lose readers when he starts talking about this ESP research. It's all garbage. Well, of course they think that. They don't know. They don't know. They're on a deadline. They go online. They see some critical stuff that's published. They look at Wikipedia, and they do. And they draw an opinion from it. They just don't know. They just don't know. This research is not understood, but it is plain as day. And you don't have to believe in ESP. I mean, we're, at the Edgar Cayce Foundation, so I assume, we all get one another. But I would sit down and I would say to a critic, I'm not asking you to presuppose that ESP exists. It's just a question. Why is this statistical anomaly going on? Why? Can't we study it? Why is it going on when we're in this exquisitely relaxed state? So that's one exercise that I would invite you to try if you feel like it. Here is a second exercise that I invite you to try. I call it the three-step miracle. I like to use modest terms. I don't like to overstate things, oversell things. It's based on an exquisite little book which I gave away to somebody today, called It Works. It's a little pamphlet that was written in 1926 by a Chicago typewriter salesman who didn't put his name on it. He only put his initials on it, RHJ. His name was Roy Herbert Jarrett, and he was a wonderful man, and he waited until he was well into middle age before he produced this beautiful little pamphlet called It Works, because he wanted to be sure that he had validated the ideas in his own lived experience. Here is the three-step miracle. It's very, very simple. So simple, in fact, that serious people are apt not to do it because they think it sounds silly. Well, why don't you find out? You are, in step 1, to make a list of what you really want out of life. But not just any list, not some hokey list, not, I want to be happy, but a list where you really hold yourself to the most mature and sustained scrutiny of your inner desires and hold nothing back. Because something might come up on that list that you don't like. I'm a nice person. I don't want to do this. Hold nothing back. Keep writing and rewriting and rewriting and rewriting this list in private until you feel that you have really nailed and gotten down what you want out of life. And I can't emphasize enough, don't trust your habits, because we repeat things to ourselves all the time and it becomes these rote expressions. I like my job, I like puppies, I like this. Don't rely on anything rote. Don't rely on anything that you tell yourself. Really sit down and work on this list of what you really want. There can be one thing on it, there can be 10,000 things on it. Obviously, it should be something of a manageable length, but really work on it. When you feel you've got your list so down cold that it expresses your innermost desires, maybe stuff that you wouldn't tell to the person you most trust or most love in life, it's yours. You are to then read the list morning, midday, and night. I advise, following on this hypnagogic method, reading it just when you're coming to in the morning. Make it the first thing you do. Read it at midday in a state of relaxation. I would advise reading it at midday after you eat lunch, when you might be in a mild state of drowsiness, and preferably you should be able to go somewhere private and just reflect on your list. Read it a third time just before you drift off to sleep at night. Okay? So this is step 2. You have your list, that's 1. Step 2, you read it just as you come to in the morning, just as you're relaxing, hopefully, if you can, after your midday meal, and just before you drift off at night. Then, step 3, tell no one what you're doing. It's your business. It's no one else's business. A friend of mine says it's like the movie Fight Club. No one talks about Fight Club. And so tell no one what you're doing. It's your business. Because if you tell other people, you're going to meet someone who's been reading Wikipedia and they're going to say, that's ridiculous, or, they'll run it down, or, listen, life is difficult. We all have friends and family members who are jealous, who are hostile, whatever. You can spend your whole life asking why, but that's the case. You don't want anyone running down, this is yours. Okay, so that's step 3. Silence. Tell no one. And then, watch what happens and express thanks when good things come to you. And have faith. And that's it. That's it. That's the 3-step miracle. Try it. It's natural to look at something like that and say, can I get my money back for this conference? Because I came to see Lindsay Wagner, and this is nonsense. It's very natural, and I understand it. It seems too simple, right? Try it. Try it. The fact is, here's something that I believe is behind the engine of this experiment that I'm describing to you, and it's been my personal experience, or I would not recommend it. And it's this. I think that there are tremendous energies, and I say that very broadly, in our deepest desires. But we do not come in touch with what our deepest desires are because we are embarrassed, or we're afraid they're going to be run down by other people, or we are kind of addicted to repeating certain habitual things to ourselves. We think we know what we want. If you say to somebody, do you know what you want? They're going to say, of course I know what I want. I want this job and this apartment and to go to vacation in this place, and yes, I want good things for my kids, and so on and so forth. That voice is not necessarily the voice of our deepest, most supple mind. There's another voice that we rarely discover or listen to because we are so self-conditioned by what we think we are supposed to want. And I think this experiment, if it's done with all your guts and all your being, will put you in front of ideas and aims that you may have never known you had. And those things can be just extraordinarily powerful. Extraordinarily powerful. Here's my third and final exercise. I'm going to sneak in a fourth just because I feel like cheating, and I feel like it. But I'll try to be fast because the clock is running out, and I really do want us to have a time for an exchange. Napoleon Hill, the author of Think and Grow Rich, had an extraordinary idea that relates to what I just described. He believed that in life you needed a definite chief aim, and that we waste and spill and squander our energies because we lack a definite chief aim. And he felt very strongly that if you don't have a definite chief aim, and of course Edgar talks about this, talks about the importance of having an aim, having an ideal, but Napoleon Hill, to his credit, wrote about this with just the most earnest and dead seriousness. And he said, you walk around, I walk around all day long with this admixture of competing aims, some of which directly contradict one another. And he said, you need one chief aim. It's the only thing that's going to get you anywhere. Now, the natural response to that is, but there are lots of things I want. What about the list Horowitz told me to make? And da-da-da. Don't worry about that. It is okay to want lots of things, but you have to have one chief, concrete, non-negotiable aim. And let me tell you, it may not be very romantic, okay? The industrialist Andrew Carnegie said his aim was to get rich making steel. Now, that might not sound like it sets your heart on fire, but that's what he wanted. Okay. Well, Gandhi wanted to free a nation. That was his aim, okay? It didn't mean that Gandhi didn't want a place to lay his head at night or to be healthy. But his chief aim was to free a nation. Andrew Carnegie's chief aim was to become a steel magnate. Don't be embarrassed. It could be something that you think, oh man, that sounds so petty, that sounds so selfish. Says who? Says who? Hugh Lynn's chief aim was that his father's work would be preserved in a center that could act on its own, that didn't have to go to anybody for permission to do anything, but that was a member-supported organization. Well, here we stand, right? What is your chief aim? I really want you to regard this with the most deadly seriousness. The most deadly seriousness. Read Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich. The whole book, which is wonderful, is filled with different expressions of that one idea, that you have to have a chief, definite aim. And it can be anything. I like that he called the book Think and Grow Rich because it kind of hits people where they live and it gets them to pay attention. But I tell everyone, there's no artist that should not read that book. There's no activist, whatever you stand for, that should not read that book. It is a book about how to get things done and how to enlist some of these energies of the mind. And really, truly, you can read that thing inside out, backwards and forwards, and I would recommend rereading it every year, at least. But you'll find that chiefly it's an expression of this one principle. I'm going to close, I promised 3, but I'm going to add one more, just because I feel like it. We're always told that change begins from within, and I feel that's true. I think everyone in this room would agree with that. But there are ways that you could enlist your inner energies that come from the outside. So my other experiment that I want to suggest to you is this. Within the limits of reason, I want you to dress however the hell you want and see what happens. See what happens. I'm not suggesting that you should go to a funeral in flip-flops, although it has been known to occur. I'm not suggesting that you should do something that embarrasses or compromises people you love or people who depend upon you. But if you can cultivate an outer appearance, if you want to dress like a drum majorette, then dress like a drum majorette. What I'm saying is, if you can cultivate, or not even cultivate, that's the wrong word, if you can permit yourself to comport yourself, to have whatever style you want, whatever it is, you will find, I suspect, and experiment with it, that it will engender in you a kind of confidence that abets your ability to get things done. All 3 of these experiments that I have given you can be aided and helped by allowing yourself to dress and comport yourself however you want. I'm going to be writing a column in Science of, I write a monthly column in Science of Mind magazine. An upcoming column, which I haven't submitted yet, will be called The Psychology of Clothing. And it's that very argument in a nutshell. Previous generation was told, don't dress for the job you have, dress for the job you want, or dress for success. Well, along came Mark Zuckerberg with his hoodie. I like his style. I'm convinced he's going to enslave us all someday, but, he looks good. And I really think that these little things sometimes that we can tell ourselves are unspiritual or are unbefitting of a deep person or unbefitting of a serious person can make an enormous difference in helping to engender and vitalize some of the energies that we are trying to summon up in these 3 experiments that I've described to you tonight. So that's kind of an extra credit suggestion. If you feel like doing it, do it. And then, Kevin Todeschi will say to me, why is everyone coming to work in volleyball clothing? But so be it. I bet you'll be more effective. I bet you will. So this was the wonderful gift given to us by Edgar Cayce. He encapsulated this entire philosophy of mental metaphysics in this one beautiful phrase from this one reading of July 15th, 1928, in which he said, "The spiritual is the life. The mental is the builder. The physical is the result." Let's take that teaching and everything that we've talked about here tonight and go off and experiment so that the next generation can look back on us in the way that we look back on Edgar and Hugh Lynn. And I wish you all, everyone in this room, the deepest, deepest success in this undertaking. And I thank you very, very much. Thank you.